I'm a big believer in riffs and production and songs not being more than they need to be.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
My name's Tom, and I'm the main guy behind Altar of Gore.
And Tom, as the main guy behind Altar of Gore, I believe you have a pseudonym, right?
Yes, I go by Acolyte of the Foul Ones. Sorry.
And how would you describe the music of Altar of Gore?
I would say that Altar of Gore is very simple by design. I hesitate to call myself minimalist just because I think it connotes something different, but I'm a big believer in riffs and production and songs not being more than they need to be. So I'd say, again, very simple, but primitive and violent, I would also say, is a big part of it. For me, I wanted to evoke sort of a spirit of violence because, in line with the lyrics and the production and everything. But I will say it's also, I honestly don't usually try to overthink those kinds of things. And I think that's why it's kind of difficult for me to say. I just kind of know what Altar of Gore is and what it's supposed to sound like. And a riff is an Altar of Gore riff or it's not. And at this point, after being a band since 2016 or so, I know what it's supposed to be. And yeah.
Now, would you say Altar of Gore is rooted in any one genre or maybe an era? Do you draw from anything specific?
I think, at least in the beginning, there was more conscious desire to draw mostly from old Finnish and old American black metal. But Herod is an omnipresent influence in anyone. I think, especially these days, they're more popular than ever. But also bands like Black Witchery, Art Goat, Profanatica, Vaughn. And then, I'd say that about covers it. But really things that are just, again, a little more minimal, but also evil, but also harsh.
And you've been involved in a number of projects over the years. When you say you have a very clear idea of what Altar of Gore is, I'm curious, and we can speak about this more when we speak about your songwriting, but did you go into Altar of Gore wanting to do something very different from your other projects?
I wouldn't say I didn't necessarily seek for it to be different than other projects. It's all of my projects are different projects just because I think the idea is strong enough that it needs to be its own thing. So it was more that Altar of Gore just coalesced in a way that made sense to me, and I was just able to put it together.
Now, you said you started this project in 2016 or 2017. What were your intentions at the time? What was Altar of Gore meant to be? And why did you start this separate from everything else?
Well, at the time, what my friends and I always referred to as triangle metal was very popular. That whole thing where everyone was into deep occultism and theistic Satanism and lots of sigils and triangles all over the album covers and stuff like that.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
There was a famous silly video of some guy, I don't remember what band it was, but he was actually making a triangle with his fingers. It was one of those bands. My friends and I always thought that was really, really funny, and I still think that's really funny, honestly. But I mean, I'm not really against it per se. Like, go do what you want to do. Like, I think the occult's cool. I'm not like into trying to cast spells or anything like that, but as a thing to be into and be interested in, I think it's neat. But I just always thought it was a little corny for myself. And especially because a lot of it was so kind of like lofty and philosophical and, again, like theistic and whatever you want to call it. And it was never really for me. And I kind of grew to like the idea of, what if, instead of trying to open your third eye and go to the spiritual realm, what if all of your power comes from something really profane, like blood and gore and the body and the earth and all of those things. And this kind of idea of like mysticism, but from really non-mystic places, kind of grew to appeal to me. And it was also around the same time that, the band Perverted Ceremony was very popular. They still are, of course, but right when their first album came out, Nuclear War Now repressed it like 11 times in a year or something absurd like that. I don't remember what it was. And I just really, really liked what they were doing, this really bass-driven, repetitive, raw, screw you, we're going to use a 4-track in 2017 kind of thing. And I just thought, I want to try and do something like that. Just, again, really raw and bassy and mean. So I'd say those two ideas fit very neatly together. And that was kind of the impetus to start the band.
Now, you handle almost all of the instrumentation by yourself, as well as the production. I'm curious if you set out to do this as a solo project, or if that's just how it developed. and you stuck with it that way?
It's, I mean, kind of both. I mean, I do have other people involved in the band, particularly to play live, but it's just, I don't know. I had the idea and I can play all the instruments, and I just decided with that one that I wanted to do it all myself. And I think I had done it before with another project or two, but there had never really been as strong of a concept behind it for me, I guess. So this was one of the first times where I really felt like, oh, I have this idea. Now I'm going to execute it. And then I did. And that itself was kind of a driving force to keep going.
Sure. And when you sit down to write an Altar of Gore song, what's the process? How do you usually start?
I mean, honestly, I'll just be playing guitar and I'll come up with something that sounds kind of cool and just try to expand it from there. I think that songs in and of themselves, they kind of, as a unit, there are like certain melodies or motifs that might come back up. So it usually just starts with one or two parts that sound really cool together, and I just kind of build the song from there.
Do you have a good idea of where you want a song to go when you start playing, when you start writing?
Sometimes, I mean, when you start with one part in particular, ultimately it's like, okay, well, how do I get there? Am I starting here? Are we going somewhere else? And so in a way, yeah, just the first piece of the puzzle, you have to get there somehow, and then you have to go somewhere from there. So in a way, yes, but there are plenty of times where I wrote a riff and thought it was going to be, the intro or the big heavy middle part or whatever, and ultimately decided to change it and have it do something totally different. So even if I have an idea, it sometimes changes. My big thing is that it just has to make sense, for the song and for the band and everything. I think that it's obvious when a song or a band just, they don't have a cohesive idea of what they're doing, or they don't have like their vision in check, I guess. And I don't like that. So I try very hard to make sure it all syncs up.
Now, is your process for writing for Altar of Gore different than any of your other projects? Or do you feel you're pretty consistent from project to project?
Pretty consistent from project to project. One thing that's definitely consistent is if I have an idea like, oh, if I'm going to sit down and write an Altar of Gore riff, 9 times out of 10, I will come up with something cool, but for something different. So I will have these intentions, sure, but a lot of the time I just come up with what I come up with and take it from there. I try not to overthink it too much, like if it makes sense to me, I just roll with it.
You described Altar of Gore with very specific feelings. I think you used the words primitive, pummeling, the feeling of violence. Is it easy for you to keep all your projects separate and keep what you write for the other projects separate from Altar of Gore?
Yes, for the most part. I mean, again, most of my projects, I have a very specific idea in mind of what it's going to be. And I try usually to do this very intentionally, because I know that, if I wanted to start something else where I thought that it might conflict with something else I was doing, then maybe I wouldn't, go for it. For example, I had an idea of maybe trying to do, a gore grind project, just because grindcore is like a big part of my history in extreme music. But I realized that anything I came up with that, in that down tuning, probably more chromatic style, would probably just wind up being used for Altar of Gore.
Right.
So, I might pursue it one day, but it would have to be grind in a way that it was very different from this. You know what I mean?
And is that something that's very conscious, that you're very conscious about when you're writing? Do you want to keep your projects as separate as possible?
Yes, oh, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of people that do a bunch of bands, but they all kind of sound the same. What's really the point of having different bands? You could just have one big badass discography. But again, I just really don't like it when bands, sound really different album to album. I value consistency. And so I am definitely intentionally trying to keep things consistent, album to album, project to project, stuff like that. At the same time, things will develop a little bit. Like, I don't think that every project exists in a vacuum and, it doesn't, will never change and never evolve, because obviously they will. But I still try to keep a pretty firm grasp on the reins, I guess you could say. So yes, I would definitely say it's an intentional part of the process.
And do you feel Altar of Gore is something that can evolve?
Well, I think it has, but evolution's a tricky thing because I feel like because all of my projects have these specific ideas, I have to kind of balance it with not going too off the cuff. But I also have found that the more I think about consciously trying to move something forward, move something in a different direction, that kind of holds me up just subconsciously. I don't really know why. But my good friend Joe from Siege Column once told me when I was having a discussion about this very subject, just do the same thing and it's going to be different because it's a different time and place that it's coming from. And I definitely think that there's a lot of truth to that. That was a big principle in what guided me coming up with everything for the second Ultra of Gore LP. Is just writing more Ultra of Gore songs, writing another Ultra of Gore album. And I do think that in some ways it has progressed and in some ways is different from what came from before, but definitely retains the core ideology and everything else.
So let's talk about that second Altar of Gore album. It's called Litanies of the Unceasing Agonies, and it will be released on the 17th of May through Nameless Grave Records. We spoke a little bit about the evolution and the progression of Altar of Gore. On this album, this upcoming album, what form would you say that evolution has taken?
I mean, it's kind of tough to articulate. I guess there are. Well, one way that's definitely developed is in the first album, I told myself that I wasn't allowed to go over the fifth fret until the very last song. So the entire first album is frets 0 to 5 until the very last song. So this time, all the songs were allowed to go to that sixth fret. And actually, some of them go to the seventh fret now. So without sounding too flippant, that is definitely one thing that has progressed with the band. I guess I just allowed myself to try a couple different more parts. I'd say that there's maybe more conscious death metal influence this time. There are a couple parts where it's definitely meant to be a real headbanging moment. And I feel like that is not always present in a lot of Black Death, whatever you want to call it. Where it's all go, no slow, and it's obviously headbangable, but, without those slow, big, mid-tempo parts that just make you want to headbang that death metal is so good for. And aside from that, I mean, the concept for the lyrics is advanced too in some ways. The first LP was just kind of descriptive, and I'd say this delves a little bit more into the mythology behind everything. So that's a progression as well.
Now, is there an overall concept that carries from album to album?
Yeah.
And maybe defines each album?
Yeah, so there is a lyrical concept that the band is about. I don't want to go into crazy detail describing it, but it more or less describes the rites and practices of obscure cults that use sacrifice and human blood for divination and other things. And this is a concept that was very much inspired by my love of high fantasy, epic fantasy stuff, especially things like the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Tremendous influence on me in many ways. And so again, the first album was just kind of describing them, and this one goes a little bit deeper into why they do the things they do and what it means for them. But I've always also, throughout the entire project, I've always been very conscious about trying to describe these things in more of an academic way. I'm not trying to make up these spooky names for all the gods and all this, whatever stuff like that. I wanted it to kind of be like someone later writing about what they did. So not from the first person, but from a third person, if that makes sense.
Sure. Almost like a Lovecraft kind of thing, where it's like somebody encountering an older religion or an occult being and describing what they experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, is this something that you have an interest in separate from Altar of Gore? Do you write fiction, or do you have an interest in going in that direction?
Maybe one day. I mean, don't rule it out. I love to write. I studied history in college and wrote way too many papers in my time there. And that's definitely something that I like to do, but I've never really sat down and tried, to be honest with you. Certainly read enough. I might give it a shot one day, but, But aside from that, definitely more reading it is more my interest.
When did you start working on Litanies?
Well, more intentionally, let's see, I recorded most of it last year. So probably the year before last is when I started in earnest trying to do it. As we talked about already, I have a lot of different projects and a lot of different focuses. And part of what comes with that is if I'm working on one or two things, other things are kind of not being thought about. So there was a time when I was working on other stuff and Altar of Gore wasn't really in my head. And once I wrap those up and I've got space in my brain again, basically I can say, okay, I'm going to sit down and maybe make more of an effort now. I'm always writing riffs and I'm always coming up with stuff. And sometimes I come up with something I really like, but I just don't have a place for it. And, when I do come back into the headspace of writing for another band, I'm like, oh shit, that riff was really cool. Let's try that. And there are actually a couple songs on this album where some of the riffs have been in my head for almost a decade at this point. Actually, one song in the first single that's being premiered soon, as of the time of recording this, has a riff that's been in my head, I think, since 2011 or 2012 or something like that. So some of these things have been percolating for a long time, but it's just kind of a matter of when it comes together in my head and when I have the mental real estate necessary to create something like that, then it comes together. So kind of 2 years, but also kind of a long time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And you recorded this yourself. Do you have your own studio, or do you work mostly with the DAW?
I mean, I do record myself, obviously. I have my own home studio, but I live in an apartment, so I can't, be running a drum kit, setting the drum kit up and recording loud amps and stuff. But we have a practice space, about 45 minutes from where I live. So you just set aside a day and go in and bang out as much as you can. And I usually just do it in a couple different sessions. The drums I did all in one, which was very painful. It's about 10, 12 hours I was in there banging it all out, which was awful, but you do what you have to do. Guitars and bass, obviously, were spread out a little bit more. But then I mixed it all at home. I have a little home studio with a bunch of gear. I'm sitting here right now, actually. And I, mix here, but so it's kind of spread out.
Would you say that the production of the albums is very integral to the sound of Ultra of Gore? I mean, it seems to me like there's a very specific sound that you have in mind when you create this music.
I mean, it's less about me having a very specific mixing idea or anything like that. It's more about me just being able to do it myself. I've recorded in other studios and done that, and that's a fine experience. But when I'm on the hook for everything myself, I would much rather just record it myself too, because then I can just work at my own speed and I'm not paying someone by the hour, or I'm not wasting somebody's time, like sitting there waiting for me. So it's more important for me to be able to just work at my own pace when it's important for that project. So in some ways, yes.
So is self-recording more about practicality?
Ultimately, yes. I don't want to have to pay somebody to record me every time, but I have owned a bunch of mics since I was 15 and have all the gear to do it. So it is practical. It's also because I know how to do it to some extent. So I just like to be able to do it myself. But I'm also a bit of a control freak with my own music. So that's definitely part of it too.
As an engineer, what's the approach to Ultra of Gore? What are you looking to capture?
Just the music, honestly. I mean, I'm going to fully admit that, I've been recording since I was 15, so over half my life now. And I don't know if I've ever really been like, all right, I'm going to make it sound like this when I start. I just honestly just kind of do the same thing every time. I know what I like for mixing. I know what I like the sound of. Mic wise, obviously you can try different stuff for different projects. For Ultra of Gore, I actually close mic'd everything, including the cymbals, which is a new thing for me. But that was more because there was a band rehearsing in the room next door, and I wanted to make sure I didn't get any of them on the album as well. So that was fun. And then, but yeah, just getting a good, concise, solid, audible recording. I'm a little bit more in the school these days of trying to record it clean and then strategically making things dirty, as opposed to intentionally recording everything to sound like total garbage, which is fine sometimes, But this is the second album, and the concept to me is pretty refined to this point. And I wanted to try and give it a good, solid representation. So maybe what I did intentionally do with the recording this time is I made it more clear than in the past. I didn't record the first album. That was Joe from Siege Column. He did an amazing job, and I love his style. But I also did this to myself this time because I knew it was going to take me a while, and I didn't want to burden him over months to get it done.
And would you say that the clarity is a result of the close miking?
Yeah, to some extent, but it's also from mixing it. I'm not really big into like very clean recordings to begin with. I like everything with a little bit of dirt. I have like an analog console and some other stuff that I like to run stuff through just to give it that slime or whatever you want to call it. But I just kind of allowed it to be a little bit more clear, I guess. I've also gotten better at mixing, as I've gotten. I'm not going to say I'm a professional because I'm definitely not, but I've just gotten better at using what I have recorded and making it sound acceptable to myself.
Now, we spoke a little bit about the evolution of Altar of Gore's music. Uh, is the production or is your work as an engineer also evolving?
I guess. I mean, I have a little bit more gear now than I used to.
I guess what I meant is that something that you're interested in doing? Are you also looking to evolve as an engineer?
Oh, definitely. I love recording. I've been doing it for a long time, and I'm always interested in learning new stuff and trying new stuff out when I can. But ultimately, when I know I only have one day in the studio and I know I have to also sit there and play everything, I'm just going to go with what I know works. This is one thing that I don't like about recording yourself, especially as a drummer, is the mental exhaustion that comes from both performing the whole thing and having to worry about, is this take good? Does everything sound okay? Is everything in the right place? That's a lot. And I don't like to do it, honestly, but I just knew again this time I was going to have to do it. So I am definitely trying to get better as I go, if nothing else more, just to make it easy for myself. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Yeah. Now, how do you find that balance? Because, definitely as an engineer, you're probably looking for one thing, and as a performer, maybe you're looking for something else. Are you able to find the balance, or to assess what you've done performance-wise as an engineer?
It's definitely tougher when you're doing everything yourself. It has definitely led me to keep some takes in the past that may not have been the best ones, and you have to work with what you got. Just because if I have already done the session once and torn everything down, I'm not going to have one song have a different drum sound than everything else. So if I screw something up, I'm going to do everything again. So So it is definitely hard to strike that balance. But when I'm recording everything myself, I may skew a little bit more towards get it done because you are tired than I should. But I'm working on it.
Do you want to say anything about the gentleman who mastered the album?
The gentleman who mastered, that's Dan Lowndes from Resonance Sound, who is one of the best that I have ever personally worked with. We've been doing stuff with him even back in the Death Fortress days, but he did all the blasphematory stuff, which sounds really good. And I really, really, really like what he does and really appreciate that we have somebody at the end of the chain, probably one of the most important parts of the chain, if you're getting something pressed on LP, especially, who has really good ears and really good gear, who has ears on it and can tell me, frankly and honestly, like, hey, you should probably change this. I think we do need to do too much of that with this, but I love working with Dan, and I would definitely highly recommend him to anyone else that was looking for a very competent mastering engineer.
So listeners probably know Dan from his time with Cruciamentum, but he does come up on this podcast from time to time because of his mastering work. I'm curious why you sought Dan, why you wanted to work with Dan.
Well, again, just because past experiences working with him, he always is reliable and fast, and everything he's done sounds really good. I also appreciate him because he is willing to listen to our wild ideas about how things should sound and makes it work. Maybe that might be a little bit more at some of the other projects in Altar of Gore. I try to be pretty reasonable with my audio demands, but for the Blasphematory album, for example, which has just an excessive amount of bass by design, he was able to maintain that, but also make sure that it's not going to destroy your needle on your turntable or whatever when you try to play it. So I really appreciate engineers or people in technical roles who are willing to take those kind of wild demands and make them a reality.
I'm assuming part of the appeal of somebody like Dan is, he's been so involved in this kind of music that he understands intuitively what it's supposed to sound like or what you're going for. Would you work with someone who doesn't come from a similar background?
I would probably hesitate to. I mean, just because, one of my favorite examples of this is Breeding the Spawn by Suffocation. They didn't want to send him to Morris Sound again because it was too expensive. So they sent him to some random studio that didn't record metal. And you can hear the way it's recorded. They didn't even have the same microphone on the two kick drums. So it just sounds like a mess. And that album gets very unfairly panned because of its production. I actually think it's the best Suffocation album personally. But that's a great example of why, if you have the option to work with somebody that does work with metal, you should. Just because I think sound and production are really important. Not necessarily that they're good, but that again, it works for the band in question. And I feel you run a much higher risk of having that be the case with someone who's not kind of in it, if that makes sense.
So you mentioned the live lineup for Altar of Gore. Do you guys have anything planned for, as far as tours or gigs coming up, going into the summer?
At this exact moment, we don't actually. The only thing I have on the calendar right now is Siege Column playing at MDF in a month or so. But aside from that, we haven't had anything pop up yet. And we've been focusing a lot on recording and rehearsing for other stuff in this year. So because we have so many other things going, these projects are kind of just on standby until they're not. So we don't meet all the time to rehearse for Altar of Gore. We have a show like, all right, a month before, we're going to start practicing the set and make sure it gets all nailed down. So it's definitely more of like an on-call thing, I guess, if that makes sense. But at this point, we don't have anything on the calendar, but hopefully when the album comes out, that will change.
So Litanies of the Unceasing Agonies will be released through Nameless Grave Records on May 17th. Tom, please tell everyone how they can order the album.
You can order it directly from Nameless Grave at their web store, and you can buy a lot of other stuff there because he has a great selection. You can also buy it online from Bandcamp digitally if that's your thing. And we will also have a cassette version available from NVNM when the time comes. But I urge you to buy, it's also on CD from Nameless Grave if you are a compact disc warrior. But I urge you to buy as much as you can from Nameless Grave when you do so.
And Nameless Grave is putting out some vinyl versions of this, right? Like a couple, like at least one variant?
Yes, they are. Yes, they're doing a black vinyl and a red vinyl version. I believe the black is 100 and the red is 400, but the numbers could be off on that. Brendan could confirm that.
And if people want to follow Altar of Gore online, what's the best way to do that?
The best place is the NVNM Instagram, which is just NVNM Prod. We don't have an official page for the band or anything, but that is the best, most direct place to find any news.
Now, do you want to say anything about NVNM, the collective that you have that encompasses a lot of your projects?
Yeah, NVNM was just an entity created to represent and distribute the various projects of myself and Joe and Sean from Siege Column. And it's just an outlet for our music. And yeah, that's it. Not much more to say.
Well, just out of curiosity, I mean, because you mentioned Death Fortress, I'm not familiar with Siege Column or some of the other projects that you have, but I'm curious if there's an overall philosophy that unites the different projects.
I would say that the overarching philosophy is that we want to do, or maybe a better way to put this, the overarching philosophy is that we want to do what we want to do. We want to make music that we like. We want to distribute it on our terms, and we want to be able to present it the way that we want. And I'm actually quite proud to say that, over the years, we have really been able to stay true to ourselves and kind of keep a minimal but existent presence online. And we just do this because we love to do it and because it's what we want to do. So if I had to sum it up succinctly, it's just the method, the vehicle for us to express ourselves and the vehicle for us to make the music we want to listen to.
And you mentioned that Siege Column will be playing MDF this year. Is there any news for any of your other projects that you want people to know about?
Honestly, there's too many to think about.
Okay.
But I think that the bands that we mentioned here are a good focus.
Very cool. Is there anything else you want to say?
Just wanted to thank you for having me on the podcast. I appreciate your time, and I hope everyone checks out the new album. And if you like it, great. If you don't, that's cool too.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thanks for your time.
history